Finney County, Kansas, June of 1934. A government agent in a clean pressed shirt steps out of a truck with a clipboard and a stack of forms and offers a farmer named Walt Prentice $18 a head for every animal standing in his lot. Cash on the spot. More than the stockyards in Dodge City would have paid him that same week, even in a good year. Walt takes the deal on most of the herd. He has to. There is no feed left standing on his ground and hasn't been for a year. And the cattle are already down to bone and hide. But before the truck pulls out of the lane, he walks 4 cows and a bull calf around the back of the barn, out past the windbreak, and does not mention them again to anybody wearing a government badge. He feeds those 5 animals on chopped tumbleweed silage and the stripped inner bark of the cottonwoods along the dry creek bed for the better part of a year, on faith alone. Because he has already decided he is not starting over from zero the day the rain finally comes back to this country. Here's the twist, friend. The agencies sent out to save this country's farmers were not lying to them, and most families were grateful down to the bone for every single dollar those trucks brought rolling up the lane. But saving a family and saving a family's future turned out to be 2 entirely different jobs, and nobody in Washington was handing out the second one. I'm Amos Whitfield, 5th generation on Whitfield land between Kansas and Nebraska. My grandfather Homer kept a journal from 1934 until the year he died, in handwriting that got tighter and more careful whenever a given season had gone badly. And more than half of what follows came straight out of his own hand, written down the same week it happened, not remembered years later, and cleaned up for the page. If this is your first time here, go ahead and hit subscribe, because we spend our time exactly in this gap, between what a government program was genuinely built to solve and what a family actually needed to make it through the winter after that program had already moved on to the next county. Number 14 is the machine the government spent a full decade promising, and Homer's own father never once sat around waiting for it to arrive. Number 4 is a family that got turned away from a federal camp for having the wrong piece of paper in hand, and exactly what the neighbors did about it that same night. 20 counted down. And I want to be fair about every single one of them as we go. Because this isn't really a story about villains, friend. It's a story about the space between help and enough, and how a family learned to live in that space without waiting on anybody's permission. Number 20. Stretching the herd past the buyout. When the Agricultural Adjustment Administration rolled out its emergency cattle purchase program in 1934, it paid families $14 to $20 a head for animals that had nothing left to eat. And for most of the plains, it was, by every honest account, a genuine lifeline. Over half the cattle bought that first year were too far gone to save anyway, and were simply destroyed on the spot. But a family that sold every last animal it owned sold its own future along with the drought-starved present, and some held back a small breeding core, 4 or 5 head, kept alive on chopped Russian thistle and stripped elm and cottonwood bark, forage nobody at the county relief office was teaching anybody, because the program's whole stated purpose was reduction, not preservation. County extension bulletins didn't publish thistle silage recipes until years after the fact. The families who already knew it in their bones never needed the pamphlet to begin with. Homer's own father did exactly this on our own ground that same summer. And the herd he rebuilt off those 5 animals is the same bloodline, thinned and crossed a dozen times over, that still grazes this land today. Number 19. The hedge that beat the government to the punch. Long before Franklin Roosevelt signed the order creating the Prairie States Forestry Project in 1935, Plains families had already been planting Osage orange in dense, thorny, impenetrable rows as living fence, a practice going back to the 1850s. Well before barbed wire ever reached this country. Those same hedgerows happened to slow the wind and hold the snow exactly the way a proper windbreak was supposed to. The federal Shelter Belt program eventually planted 220 million trees across 6 states, and rightly gets remembered for it in every history book written since. What gets forgotten is that plenty of farms were already standing behind a hedge their own grandfather had planted 80 years earlier for entirely different reasons. That did the exact same job for free the whole time. Number 18. The pond dug before the government's turn came. Work relief crews under the WPA built farm ponds and reservoirs across drought counties starting in 1935, And it was good, honest, useful work that saved a great many real herds from real thirst across this whole region. But a WPA crew followed a schedule, county by county, section by section, moving down a list that had been drawn up somewhere in an office a long way from any actual dry creek bed, and a family whose turn hadn't come yet still had cattle standing in the yard needing water that same afternoon. Not next spring. More than one farm dug its own small stock tank by hand that same year. A shovel, and a mule-drawn scraper, and a long, hot Sunday afternoon, rather than wait indefinitely on a government survey crew to finally reach their particular section of the county whenever the list got around to it. Number 17. Trading straight instead of signing the lien. The Farm Security Administration's rehabilitation loans kept plenty of families on their land through the very worst years of the decade, and they did it in no small part by taking a formal lien against the very mules, tools, and livestock a family had left standing, which was simply how the agency protected a loan it could not otherwise be sure of collecting. Some families avoided that particular rope entirely by trading straight with a neighbor instead. Seed for seed, feed for feed, no paperwork, and no signature ever putting a government claim on the last mule left standing in the barn, and no county office ever knowing the trade had happened at all. Number 16. The terrace built ahead of the survey. The Soil Conservation Service, formed in the spring of 1935 under Hugh Bennett after Congress finally declared soil erosion a national menace, sent survey teams county by county to lay out proper contour terracing, and everywhere it actually landed, it genuinely slowed the wind and held the rain right where a field needed it most. It did not land everywhere at once, not by a long stretch, and some counties waited years for a proper survey crew to reach them at all. Farmers with nothing but a plow, a length of string, and a hand level built their own rough terraces years before any government surveyor ever reached their fence line, working off nothing but their own eye for exactly where the water wanted to run across their own particular ground. Number 15. The garden no allotment ever measured. The AAA's crop reduction program paid farmers by the acre to plow under cotton and wheat right in the middle of a hunger crisis. A policy that made hard, cold sense on paper for a collapsed commodity market and looked like plain madness to a family staring into an empty root cellar. The payment covered the cash crop acreage and nothing beyond it. It never once asked what grew in the kitchen garden behind the house, and plenty of families quietly grew that garden bigger than it had ever been in living memory, because a committee's allotment number and a family's actual hunger were never once the same arithmetic. First pattern break, friend. Everything so far a government man could have looked at, shrugged, filed the paperwork on, and moved on down the road to the next farm without much thought. What's coming next is where a family stopped waiting entirely and started working around a promise the government hadn't gotten around to keeping just yet. Number 14. The windmill kept turning by hand. The Rural Electrification Administration, created in 1935, eventually brought power lines out to farms that had never once had them, and it changed the plains for good when it finally arrived. It took years to reach the most remote sections, and some farms waited the better part of a decade for a line to finally cross their fence and reach the yard. In the meantime, a hand-repaired windmill pump, greased and re-leathered every single season with parts salvaged off a neighbor's scrapped rig, kept water coming up out of the ground the entire time Washington was still stringing wire toward town, one pole at a time. Number 13. Insisting on the meat instead of the check. Roughly half the cattle the government bought under. The emergency purchase program were healthy enough to process, and those went to the Federal Surplus Relief Corporation for distribution to hungry families elsewhere in the country, which was, by any honest measure, a genuinely good use of an animal that would have otherwise starved in a field. A family that still had a working smokehouse sometimes asked, where the option actually existed, to take a share of processed meat instead of the flat per head price, because $18 in cash bought considerably less by the following winter than 100 pounds of cured beef already hanging from the rafters. Number 12. The blacksmith, over the loan. Government-backed equipment loans put tractors on plenty of farms that genuinely needed them and could not have modernized any other way without that credit behind them. They also put a real debt on the books that some families were still paying off well into the next decade. long after the drought itself had broken. A neighborhood blacksmith who could reforge a broken plowshare or true up a bent axle kept an old horse-drawn rig working another 5 years, entirely debt-free, for the price of a Saturday afternoon and whatever scrap iron happened to be lying around the shop floor. I want to be honest with you about something here, friend, because I don't like telling this whole story as though every family made the harder choice every single time. Homer's journal admits, in his own handwriting, that his own family took the tractor loan the year it was offered, and he never once regretted it. Not on paper, and not out loud in front of me growing up. Some of what I'm counting down for you today was the braver road. Plenty of it was simply the road a family happened to already know, worn smooth by their own grandparents, sitting right there, waiting to be used again, the moment the newer road ran out. Number 11, the trade that skipped the committee. AAA crop control committees decided allotments county by county, and a farmer who wanted seed corn or a few days of a neighbor's team had to work inside whatever the committee had approved for that particular season. Neighbors traded straight for exactly what they needed anyway. A wagon of seed for a week of labor, settled over a fence post with a handshake, nothing written down, and no form ever filed with anybody in town. Second pattern break. From here on down, friend, every single item on this list is where a family stopped working politely around a government program's edges and started making a decision the program itself had never once had a line item for. Number 10. Refusing the buyout on the land itself. The Resettlement Administration and the Farm Security Administration after it offered to purchase marginal farmland outright and relocate whole families to better ground elsewhere. A real and sometimes genuinely kind offer for land that truly, honestly, could not be saved by any amount of effort. Some families turned it down flat on land nearly as bad as the ground the government wanted to buy, and spent years hand terracing and mulching and shelter belting the same tired acres instead, betting their whole future on the idea that the dirt under their own boots was worth more than whatever number was written on the check. Number 9. Farming past the number. A hungry family with ground still capable of growing food did not always stop precisely at the acreage a crop control committee had approved that season. Whatever the financial incentive not to, and whatever the neighbor 2 farms over who did stick to his allotment might have thought about it. Enforcement varied wildly from county to county and depended entirely on how closely anybody happened to be watching a given quarter section that particular year, and plenty of families simply grew what their own table actually required and worried about the allotment paperwork only if somebody ever came around asking questions about it. Number 8. The well that never waited on certification. As individual states began requiring formal certification for any new well during the worst stretch of the water crisis. A family with a working hand-dug well from their own grandfather's day mostly just kept right on using it, unregistered, untested by anybody official, and running exactly as it always had for 2 generations before anybody in the state capital thought to ask about it. Because waiting on a state inspector to finally reach a remote rural county could take considerably longer than most families were willing to go thirsty in the meantime. Number 7. The strip behind the barn. Ground a family had been paid under an AAA contract to leave idle sometimes carried a narrow, entirely unofficial strip of corn, or beans anyway. Tucked in behind the barn, where a passing inspector's eye rarely bothered to reach, food that never once showed up on any government ledger anywhere, and never needed to in the first place. Third pattern break, friend. The last stretch of this count. Everything from here on down is where the neighbors stopped solving this alone, quietly, behind a barn, and started solving it together instead, out in the open, in front of anybody at all who cared to stand there and notice. Number 6. Canning what the relief truck brought. Government commodity distribution put flour, lard, and canned meat into hungry hands across the entire Plains region. Real food that kept real families alive through real winters when there was genuinely nothing else standing between them and going without. And I want that said plainly before I go any further. Some of what arrived was better preserved for the long haul than it came off the truck. and a farm wife with a pressure canner and a free afternoon turned a single commodity tin of meat into a dozen jars that would outlast the particular winter the original can had only ever been meant for, stretching one delivery into 2 or 3 months of suppers instead of one. Number 5. Schoolhouse rules bent for planting week. Compulsory school attendance and relief eligibility became increasingly tied together as the decade wore on, and a family that kept children home during a planting or harvest emergency risked a truancy officer's visit and, in the stricter counties, an actual mark against their standing for relief that could follow them for months. Plenty of families made that trade anyway, without a second thought and without much guilt about it either, because a properly planted field fed everybody under that roof far longer than a single week of arithmetic lessons ever could have. Number 4. The family the camp turned away. Federal relief camps, like the ones the Farm Security Administration built for displaced families, places like Weed Patch in California, ran on real sensible rules meant to keep the peace and the sanitation working properly for everyone living inside that fence. And by every account, those camps genuinely improved life for the families lucky enough to get through the gate. A family without the exact right paperwork or arriving from a county over from where their documents said they officially belonged sometimes got turned away right at that same gate, regardless of how badly they needed the water and the roof that particular night. More than one local family took a total stranger's relatives in on their own porch instead. That same evening, no camp registration required of anybody. No questions asked beyond whether there was room enough by the fire. Number 3. Rebuilding ahead of the waiting list. Government rehabilitation programs eventually helped families rebuild after a foreclosure or a fire, and the help, when it finally came, was entirely real and entirely welcome by anybody who received it. The list was long. County offices were badly understaffed through the worst years, and a burned-out neighbor sometimes had a brand new roof up, fully framed and shingled by 6 other families working a single Saturday together, fed on whatever the womenfolk could put together in somebody's kitchen that morning, months and sometimes years before their own name would have ever come up on any government ledger at all. Number 2. Standing between a family and the auction block. Even with federal foreclosure protections like the Fraser-Lemke Act working their slow way through the courts starting in 1934, plenty of farms still went up for sheriff's sale while the very paperwork that was supposed to save them sat unprocessed in some understaffed county office. Neighbors who had heard a sale was coming still showed up and stood the auction down themselves, the same exact way they always had, because a family losing their home, while a federal law technically protected them on paper, was not a contradiction anybody local was willing to sit quietly through. Number 1 is not a trick, friend. It is what every single one of the 19 before it was quietly built out of, the one thread running underneath this entire count. None of this is a story about a government that wanted to hurt anybody, and I would be lying to you if I let you walk away thinking otherwise. Most of these programs did exactly what they were built to do, and plenty of families on this very stretch of prairie would not have made it to the other side of that decade without them standing behind them. Homer's Journal has a line from 1935 about the cattle buyout that I think about more than almost anything else he ever wrote down in that book. He called it a hand up that only reached as far as the wrist. Read it again, friend, because it's the whole video in 9 words. The help was real. It reached exactly as far as it reached, and no farther. And it was also never quite the whole arm a family actually needed to stand back up on its own. What carried a family the rest of the way, past the wrist and up to the shoulder, was the thing no agency in Washington could ever put a line item on in any budget. The willingness to keep 4 cows behind the barn instead of selling the last one. The willingness to trade a wagon of seed over a fence post with a neighbor instead of standing in a line. The willingness to stand at an auction until the bidding simply stopped meaning anything at all to anybody in the crowd. That is not defiance for its own sake. And it was never meant as an insult to the men driving those government trucks up the lane. That is just what a family does, quietly and without much ceremony, in the space between help and enough. Comment down below and tell me if your own family has a story like Walt Prentice and those 4 cows out past the windbreak, or a hedgerow still standing on the property line from before the government ever planted a single tree of its own. Maybe it's a well that never got certified, or a roof somebody's grandfather helped frame in a single Saturday for a neighbor who couldn't wait on a list. I read every single one of them, and the story that shows up most often in the comments is the one I build the next video around. Pick one thing off this count and carry it forward this week, friend, however small it looks, written out on the page in front of you. Learn what actually grew, what actually kept through a hard winter, and what actually worked on your own family's ground long before any program ever showed up to tell them how it ought to be done. Next time on this channel, I'll walk you through the 2-cent trick that kept a whole county's seed corn alive through a drought the extension office swore up and down could not be beaten, and the exact year the hybrid seed companies made sure nobody would ever need to remember it again. I'm Amos Whitfield, and thank you kindly for listening.